Tonight, on this edition of The Small Interview, our guest is award-winning RVTV producer, John Letz. Hello and welcome to the Small Interview with Glamour Dave. I'm your host, David Glamour Dave Nienow, and today I happen to have as a special guest a wonderful friend of mine who is a fellow producer here at RVTV, and we're going to talk about his career in radio and what brought him to RVTV and his work that he does here. So I wish to welcome to my show my guest, John Letz.
Hey, nice to be here, David.
Yeah, John, I'm happy to have you here on the show.
And I'm glad you consider me a friend.
Yes.
And we've both done a lot of productions together here.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I've been here at the studio now as a producer for 16 months, and you know, you've been an incredibly wonderful, supportive producer, and you've turned into a really great friend for me. So much of many of the shows I've done here in the last 16 months, you've basically been on the crew in nearly every single production that I've had, and you've directed, like at this point, like 14 of my shows.
Yeah, and I love directing, and particularly your shows, especially that art show is fantastic.
Yeah, thank you. So I wanted to have you come on and talk about. I know in the past we've talked a lot about your life in Louisiana and your career in radio and so we want to talk about that.
Okay. I have notes because in radio you go to a lot of stations in a career, or a lot of people do, and I certainly did. The life of a gypsy, so I wanted to make sure I had everything organized.
Right. Okay,
you know? But just want to mention real quickly, it's kind of setting this up. One of my shows here is Adventures in Education.
Yes.
And another producer, Wanda Borland, and I went down there and shot some video and did some interviews. And you can look for that to be on Adventures in Education at Jefferson Public Radio.
Yeah.
They have brand new studios and they are beautiful. And it made me think about all these places where I've worked and the kind of equipment we had back then and how different it is.
Yeah.
And I was telling you before the show where we used to have reel-to-reel recorders, which you'll see some images of as I go into my stories here.
Yeah.
And on each one they had what's called a splicing block, and it was a little metal block about that big, and there was a groove in there that's the same width as the tape.
Yeah.
And you would press it down in there, and you had a razor blade, and you would literally cut and then splice. They had splicing tape that was just as wide. So I have a bunch of stills that I brought with me. So let's look at that first one. It's called Radio 1. Yeah. And what you'll see is what I looked like way back then.
Okay, that's a young John Letz.
That's a very young John Letz. That is a 17-year-old John Letz.
Wow.
And that was in Crowley, Louisiana, where I grew up, KSIG. And I got into radio because I wanted to impress the cheerleader, the head cheerleader. I was a freshman.
Yeah.
And I went, how does a freshman get the attention of a senior who is the main cheerleader? Well, I went down to, there was a couple of people who did a morning show. It was a two-person show, the Bill William Shell Cantor Show. And so every morning, everyone listened to them for the weather. I think they even did the school menus. I mean, we're talking small town here, okay? And so I went in that radio station one day and I met Shell Cantor. And I said, I brought some jokes for you. And I just, you know, all I want is that you say who gave them to you. And I thought, well, that'll get her attention.
Yeah.
Well, you know, these were such kind people. As it turned out, he did use some of the jokes and gave me credit for them. It didn't get me a date with the cheerleader, but what it did, it got me a connection with the radio station.
Yeah.
I would get up early in the morning and come in and watch him do his work. And he was so tolerant. I would never tolerate someone just sitting there watching me work all the time. But that's what I did. And I got to know some of the other disc jockeys.
Yeah.
Well, eventually they had a part-time disc jockey. This is after years of my reading the newspaper out loud at home and playing records on my record player and practicing all this stuff. Well, years after that, because I was 16, someone left the station, and they needed to fill a slot on the weekend. And these disc jockeys that were so, I'm sure they were sick of having me hang around all the time, they said, why don't you hire this John Letz guy, and maybe we'll get rid of him that way.
Yeah, right.
So I worked for about 3 weeks at KSIG, and honestly, David, I sounded so bad. I'm amazed they even let me go 3 weeks. So eventually it just came to a head and they went, you know what, you're just not ready yet. And so then as we go to Radio 2, this is actually a picture when I actually was 16 years old still. And this is at KAJN, a brand new station that opened in this little town, Cajun. And I'm standing there with a transmitter with my wide tie, as you can see. So that's 16-year-old me. And the thing that they had this news station, and the FCC did not let them have remote control of it. Someone had to be at the transmitter shack.
Right. Okay.
Well, that's the job I took.
Yeah.
And so I'm sitting there, and every half hour I had to take a clipboard which had a log on it, a technical log, and I had to write down what all of those meters showed. So you do that, that takes less than a minute, and then you wait 29 minutes and you do it again. So as you can imagine, it's boring. And so what I started doing then to fill the time is I would make all these phone calls. And so like I called the CBS newsroom one time and said, hey, what's going on there? You know, I just wanted to call the CBS newsroom. They hung up on me, you know. But I would make all these calls, including long distance calls, and it started a pattern that took me a long time to learn from. But you'll find that eventually it kind of paid off. But there was one day I was on the phone and I was talking and talking. And that transmitter, the piece of equipment you saw on that last slide, it had a bad habit of turning itself off at times.
Oh, okay.
And so the studio was in the city, in the downtown, and it went off the air, and so they went, we need to, you know, he hasn't put us back on the air, so let's call him. Well, I was on a phone call just talking and talking and talking. They even called my mom and said, can you go get him to get off the phone? So they finally got the operator to cut in as an emergency.
Oh, geez.
So that didn't, you know, why I didn't get fired immediately, I don't know. But they did let me go on the air a little bit. And that was, and I did work with someone who was important there. His name was Joel Scarborough, and he was a writer for Casey Kasem. And he had come out, I don't know what brought him to Louisiana, but I would work for him a little bit later as a program director. So I kept meeting all these great people, you know, during this struggle. Well, I didn't sound any better at KAJN, and the owner's son got to take my job, so that was that. So I got a weekend job also just down the road, 20 miles away in Jennings, which is 20 miles away from my hometown.
Right.
Okay. And they were a country and western station. So I would come in on Saturday, and the fellow who was there before was doing a French show. This is South Louisiana. Everything was in French. And it was funny because I would come in, and there were Budweiser cans all over the studio, because all of his buddies would stop by, you know, during his show. It's very informal, you know. And so, and the other thing, that's when I discovered how good boudin is. Now, people up here don't know what boudin is.
No.
Boudin is like a sausage. It's in a casing like a sausage,
Okay.
but it's like a rice dressing inside, and it's very, very good. And so I developed a taste for it because they always had some left over.
Yeah.
And then the other show, I came in on Sundays, and one of the people there on Sundays was Phil Phillips. If you think way back, early 60s, there was a song called Sea of Love.
Yeah, right.
And if you look at the label of that record, it says Phil Batiste. Well, that's his real name. But his public name was Phil Phillips, and he was the one who did that. He did a soul show on Sunday, and then I would finish that, go do my country and western show after that. So if we go to that next one that says Radio 3, what you'll see is that's the KSIG control room.
Right. Okay.
And for people who've never been in a radio station, that's the control, we call it the board. And those big knobs are potentiometers, which we just call pots.
Yeah.
So turn the pot up or turn the pot down. And the row of buttons there would put different things on those last two pots. So you could just switch between sources like that. In the background, that is the remote control for the transmitter. And at night, we had to reduce the power to 250 watts. It was a 1,000-watt station other than that. And then you'll see over to the right side of your image, those are what we called cart machines. They had cartridges, which you can see laying on top of them. And they were like 8 tracks, but they weren't 8 tracks.
Right,
but they were about the same size and everything. And then if you go to the next one, we can just go straight to the next one. This is the production room. And this control board behind me in the production room where we made commercials and announcements, that had vacuum tubes in it. And so that was always a warm room. And then if we go to the next one, what you'll see is over to the right side, that's the machine that recorded those cartridges. So when you finish making something on a reel-to-reel, then you would transfer it onto there, and all they had to do was pop it in the machine.
Right, okay.
And if we go to the next one, what you see, this is KJEF, the country station. And of course, back then, it was the music all came from records. And you have the 45s on there. And they were recessed, these turntables. So if you put a 33 on, it also fit. You didn't have to put any kind of adapter, in the middle. And then that bit of that microphone was a Sennheiser microphone. Another thing I remember from KJEF is on Sunday morning a preacher came in and did, we were required in those days to have a certain amount of religious programming. And so the preacher would come in, and he was one of these kind of the typical, almost, fire and brimstone. And he would start in a real low voice. I'm so glad that you're here with us today. And then he would work himself up, and he would work himself up, and he would get louder and louder. So I had to keep turning his volume down. And by the time he was really worked up, it was barely cracked open. And because he was right on the other side of the control board from me, I kept backing up and backing up, like back against the wall. And he's just, going full force with that. So, about this time, I became aware of that working at that little station was not something I wanted to do the rest of my life. It wasn't the all in all that I thought it was when I was 14.
Yeah, right.
And so I started hearing these things about bigger stations and bigger markets. And I found out that at night, if you wait till night, I could get WLS in Chicago, which was a clear channel station. And it's to this day, in that period of time, is a legendary station in rock and roll. It's top 40 station, and they called themselves the Rock of Chicago. And I would listen to people at night, and what I would see, or what I would hear, at 10 o'clock, this fella came on, his name was Bill Bailey. And he had like the voice of God. The really, really deep, resonant voice. And I would listen to him, and I just kind of related to him. It's like, I could do that. I could do what he's doing, and I would enjoy doing it. So that kind of put my sights on going to a major market. And you know, so by the time I was 16 and a half years old, that's all I could think about. You know, and 17 years old, so I'm going to go to a major market. Well, I got to do 3 radio stations in one day, and I'll show you what that looks like. If we could go up to that next image, okay. So this is his name was Dave, and he I'm sorry, Mark. That was Mark, and he worked at that same country station that I worked on the weekend. But he went to this other station, and you can see it's a grimy old, and it was very hot in there. But when I graduated from high school, they offered me a job, and so I took it. But after working there for a week, I couldn't stand it. It was uncomfortable physically. All the equipment was terrible. It's like you had to sit there with a soldering iron in your hand while you're doing your show, and so I just, at that time, I got a call from KSIG, that first station again. And they said, we're offering you a job. We want you to come in and do the night show where you do top 40. Well, that's what I really wanted to do. I didn't want to do more country. It's just that that's what the job was. So I told them, I said, I'm going to have to give you 2 weeks notice. And they said, but you've only been here a week. I said, well, yeah, but you know, I got another offer. And they said, well, don't give us 2 weeks notice, just work till the end of the week. So one day I worked at 3 radio stations. I signed on the KIKX, the full-time country job. And that was like 40 miles from my hometown. I drove 20 miles toward my hometown to Jennings because I'd given them 2 weeks notice. And so that was my last day with them. So I did a remote broadcast for them. And then I went 20 more miles to my hometown of Crowley and worked for KSIG that night. So in one day, I worked for 3 radio stations. And I kept getting the call letters mixed up.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I can see that definitely happening. I mean, you know, radio station call letters are a key identifier, so you know you want to make sure you get those correct. Yeah,
and I love working for that station again.
Yeah,
I love doing top 40, and from that moment on, I went, I'm not doing any more country, any of that stuff. I want top 40. It was going great, Dave. It was going really, really good, until I said a word that you're not supposed to say on the radio.
Oh.
Are you familiar with the line from Death of a Salesman, prick us and shall we not bleed? Somewhere in that quote is a word I said. And I said it in a bad context. So that was that. I got called in and they said, we can't keep you on. You can't say that kind of thing. And so I was just out of desperation, I took a job in Corpus Christi, Texas. So if we go up to that next slide, what you'll see is you see this is KLOU in Lake Charles, which I had to drive through to get to Corpus Christi. Well, when I got to KLOU, I thought, well, you know, I really want to work in top 40. So I stopped and asked them if I could get a job with them. And so I'm talking to the fellow who would hire me, the program director who was doing the morning show. And so we talk a little bit, and then after a while, he's playing a record. He comes in and he plops down a bunch of news copy from the Associated Press newswire. And he says, there's a minute left in the song. You're going to do a 5-minute newscast, so you better get it organized. And I was like, oh my gosh, what if there's names I can't pronounce? And down that part of Louisiana with all these French names, I mean, I could tell you LeBlanc and Thibodeau and all that, but what do you do with Aucoin and Plaisance, and all those kind of names? I was going, oh, please don't, So I did the newscast, and he says, you know what? You don't sound half bad, which, when you're 17, that's
Yeah.
a pretty good compliment. He says, but you have to have a first-class license to work at this station. So I should explain to to our viewers. Third-class license for most stations is plenty, because you have to keep that log, like I was talking about, whether it's remote control or not. And you just send off for it in the mail, and they send it to you. You think you had to pay a little, $20 or something. And so most stations, you see, everyone has to have their third-class license hung. But if the station is a directional station, which this was, you have to have a first-class license, and you have to know something about how everything works, electronically.
Right.
And so I just set my sights on, well, I'm going to get one of those first-class licenses. But first I needed to eat. So I went down to Corpus Christi, and I worked for this station, KSIX. And let's see, I think that is that next, the next one will show me there, if we're going in order here. Okay, yeah, there I am. My family actually came down, David, and I think my sister took that picture. Do you see that I look like I just woke up?
Yeah.
Well, I did. I was supposed to sign the station on at 6 o'clock. On a Sunday morning, and I overslept. And here's the thing, I didn't get fired.
Yeah.
And at that station, they played a lot of like Ferranti and Teicher, real slow, kind of piano music and stuff. Couldn't stand it. So what I would do is I would take it was all from LPs, So I'd put the 33 LP on there, and I would shift it up to 45 RPM. So it was considerably livelier than you would expect. Right. And the weird thing is, I never got a complaint. No one ever called and said, "What are you doing with my Ferrani and Teicher?"
Yeah.
So, but you see, the thing is, David, I didn't learn from the first using the telephone. And so to keep from being bored with this, when Perry Como's on, you can't put him at 45, or he sounds like one of the Chipmunks.
Yeah.
So I would call all these places again, and what I did was I called Billboard magazine, you might be familiar with, had a column. It was called Vox Jocks, and the column told you who was taking what jobs and who was being program directors at which stations and all that kind of stuff. Well, this Bill Bailey guy that I used to listen to, I didn't know where he went. I just know that I didn't hear him on WLS anymore. So I called the editor of the magazine, and I said, "Where is Bill Bailey?" And he said, "Oh, he's working at WDRQ in Detroit." So I called him. Now the thing is, in radio, when you want to get a job, you send what's called an air check, and basically it's what you say on the air with just a little bit of the songs. They don't want to sit there and listen to all the songs. I asked him for an air check because I wanted to hear what he sounded like in Detroit. Well, a little bit later, as it turns out, he would ask me for an air check, and that became something that really developed into something. And I know I'm going to have to pick up the pace a little bit on my story. So let's see the next one, and then we'll probably, the next image, the next still image. And we're going to kind of race through these. Okay, so KLOU again in Lake Charles. Next, I'm kind of orchestrating this. Next, that's just another control board. That's another remote control. Next, okay. That's Huntsville, Alabama. Stop there. That's Bill Bailey.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. So when I was at KLOU, I really worked on sounding better, and he was my model. I tried to sound like him. Well, eventually I got a call when I was in Huntsville, Alabama, and he says, "How would you like to come up to Detroit?" And I thought about a nanosecond and said yes.
Yeah.
So let's play. If you want to know what I sounded like, let's play this video clip. You won't see much video-wise, but you'll get to hear. By the way, I took the name Brother John.
Okay.
So you'll hear Brother John, not John Letz. But let's roll that, and we'll hear what
John, WDRQ.
WDRQ Detroit, where the music is best. It's a little bit past 3 o'clock. This is Brother John. And this hour, we're going to do something a little bit special. A little bit unusual, a little bit different, you know. I'm sure at one time or another you've dreamed a little bit about the whole world as one family, living in perfect harmony. Well, this hour just kind of brush away the cobwebs from those daydreams you've had. So we're going to kind of relive all the love songs. WDRQ 309 is Brother John with the Pointer Sisters, and yes, we can. We can make it happen. We can work it out. We've got to, because we are all we've got. WDRQ 312 is Brother John with the Silver Convention. This is Fly, Robin, Fly. WDRQ 317. Love Train don't need no oil. Just a little bit of caring to keep on keeping on. WDRQ 320 is Brother John in the nighttime. A melancholy time when the darkness hides the material world. That's when we get to thinking about some higher things at night. WDRQ 327 is Brother John. What is going on, brothers? Marvin Gaye.
So
All right, we're back.
That's Brother John.
Yeah.
So,
Well, yeah, that was great. Well, John, you know, it's really been great, Bill, to interview you. After all, you got to interview me a while back.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
And so I'm happy to be able to return the favor, and you know, we've talked about your radio stories in the past, and it was great to be able to kind of get them documented here on the small interview. So I very much appreciate your coming on.
Oh, you're welcome,
Yeah.
Dave. I love sharing this kind of stuff. It's just, you know, like I said, seeing that new digital equipment at JPR just made me think of the contrast of all the tools we used to use back in the day.
Well, and like the open reel stuff, I mean, I actually have a collection of that stuff in storage that my father collected. I got like a half dozen open reel tapes and hundreds of open reel tapes, you know, on the decks and stuff. So, yeah, you know, I kind of understand some of that old technology because my father was into it.
Yeah.
You know, so I thank you very much, John, for coming on.
You're welcome, Dave.
Yeah.
Very glad to be your guest.
Yeah. And so this completes this episode of my interview with John Letz for the small interview. And I thank my crew for helping with the production. And I thank you, the viewers, for watching. And we will see you next time on the small interview with Glamour Dave. And that's it for this edition of the small interview for tonight. We're always eager to hear what you have to say, so follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, and support this show at our Patreon page at patreon.com/GlamourDave. You can send us your comments to viewer@glamourdave.com.